Hello there. In this video we're going to talk to you about the difference between meshes and curves in Fluid Designer for 3D printing. We're very much, I should say I'm very much an advocate of using curves to create your 3D printable objects, but you can't actually print curves. Curves must always be converted to meshes before they can be printed. But as you'll see with exercises in the future, when you go to file and export, when you file and export an object, if it's a curve, Fluid Designer simply converts that to a mesh for you as you export it as an OBJ file, a printable file format. So if we start up Fluid Designer, we're not going to drag and drop any objects from the outliner panel. What we're going to do is to use the menu system, and this is the menu system for the objects that we can add to Fluid Designer. And what we're going to do first of all is add a UV sphere. Now if I just zoom in on that by scrolling the center mouse button, and if I click on this plus here to open up the properties panel, you see we've got a sphere. It's got dimensions at the moment, quite small. It's 2mm by 2mm by 2mm, and it's basically located at the center of the workspace. Now if I click on this plus sign up here, I'll open up the toolbox panel, and this part of the toolbox panel is really important when you add objects, because what you can do is you can make changes to the objects here. So at the moment the size, for example, of this object is 1. Well, I'm pretty sure that that's going to be the radius of this object. So a radius of 1 would mean 1mm to there, or 1mm to there. That would be the radius. So the diameter will be 2mm. Well, that's what it's telling me in the properties panel over here as the dimensions. So if I change this size to 2, so if I enter 2, you'll see that my dimensions change up to 4. I'll just switch on screencast keys so you can see key presses down here. So if I enter 1 and enter, you'll see it goes back to 2 again. Now there's some other values here, segments and rings. Well, if we just zoom in on this, let's take the segments all the way down so you can see what the segments are. The segments are going around the object in this direction, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 segments there, 6 segments. So you can make the sphere more rounded by increasing this value, and you can make it less rounded by decreasing this value. So let me set it back to 32, I think it was. So there are 32 segments going around. Now rings, well, if I hold down the center mouse button and rock it, if we count the segments this way, we'll find there are 16. But if I reduce it right down, you can see where they are. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 segments there. 5, 6, 7, 8 segments. So 1, 2, 3, 4 at the top and 4 at the bottom. So again, the higher this value, the more rounded our object will become. Now if I'd reduce it down again, I'm going to take it down to let's say I'll take it down to 8, and I'll take this down as well to 12. Okay, so we've not got a rounded sphere here. It is still a sphere, but it's quite a chunky sphere. But let's look what happens when we press the tab key on the keyboard. Well, when we press the tab key on the keyboard, this disappears for a start, and if I press tab, and what we're doing there is actually going into edit mode. And so the tab key switches between normal mode and edit mode. But notice that my selection here has disappeared now and it's gone. That's one of the disadvantages of pressing to go into edit mode. You can't change this setting anymore. You could create a new object and set values there, but they will disappear. So we can actually hide this toolbox panel now, and I can hide it by pressing the T key on the keyboard, because we're not going to use it anymore in this example. But if I go into edit mode by pressing the tab key on the keyboard, you can see that here's my sphere, and you can actually see through it now. What's happening at the moment is the whole of the object is highlighted. Now if I want to unselect, there is a selection option up here. If I want to unselect it all, I could click there, toggle deselect. So toggle select, toggle deselect. Now I can also do this on the keyboard, and it's the letter A on the keyboard. A for all, A to deselect all. A for all, A to deselect all. Now if we just zoom in a bit more, these points here are called vertices. And if I click the right mouse button, I can go to vertex select mode, and that's what I'm actually in at the moment. So I can click on a vertices, and I can actually move it and change the shape of my sphere. Okay, so those dots in the corner are vertices, because I'm in vertex select mode at the moment. If I press the X key on the keyboard, X key allows me to delete things, and I can delete the vertices that's currently selected, and notice I get a great big hole in my object now. Now if you make a mistake and delete something you don't want to delete, you can go to edit and undo and put it back. So we can delete a vertices by pressing X on, well, first of all highlighting it and then pressing X on the keyboard to delete it. If I click the right mouse button, if I change from vertex select to edge select, notice the dots disappear, but now I can click on edges of the object. Edges, so around each of these more or less squares are edges. And you can actually delete edges. So if I press X on the keyboard, I could delete the edge that's selected. And again, notice I get a hole. Now it's a different hole from last time. When I deleted this vertices here, I got 4 panels here. They're actually faces. 4 faces were deleted when I deleted that vertices there. When I've just deleted the edge, I've lost 2 of them, but I've still got a hole in the object again. So let me just put that back. Undo. Now when I've got an object, an edge selected like that, to deselect it I can press A on the keyboard. A on the keyboard will select all the edges, A will deselect all the edges. So we've got vertices, these are the dots in the corners, we've got edges, and we've got face select mode. Now when I select face select mode, you'll see that there's a little square dot appears in the middle of each of these panels, and if I click on that it will select a face. Now if I want to select more than one face, all I need to do is hold down the shift key and click on more than one at the same time. So I can select multiple faces. If I want to deselect them, it's always A on the keyboard. A for all, A to deselect all. And again, like vertices and edges, I can delete a face. So if I press X on the keyboard, I can delete that face. So deleting a face means I get 1 block deleted. When I deleted this edge here, I got 2 faces deleted. When I selected a vertices here and deleted the vertices, it actually deleted 4 faces. So depending upon what you want to do, you can go into vertices selection mode, edge select mode, or face select mode. And remember, undo if you want to put it back in there. Okay, so that's a mesh. And if I press the tab key now, I can come out of edit mode. And if I just move the mesh off to the left there, away from the center, perhaps a bit further, the other kind of object that's available to create in Fluid Designer that I use most often are not meshes but curves. And so if I go to add and curve here, now there are a number of different types of curve: Bezier, NURBS curve and NURBS circle. Well, I'm going to select actually I'm not going to select any of those. I'm going to go a little bit further down. I'm going to select a torus knot plus, and that object is created. Now if I open up the toolbox panel, you'll see there are a lot of values here that I can actually change, and as I change them the appearance of my object changes. So there's a lot of different choices, a lot of different torus knot curves that you can actually create. Now where is the curve itself? Well, if I change this value here, this thing called the bevel, if I type in there 0, that's actually my curve. The bevel is what's wrapped around the curve to make it an object and to make it 3D printable. The actual curve itself is that. And if I go into edit mode and zoom in, you'll see that there are dots around this curve which I can select, and these are called control points. Control points. Now you can delete control points like I've just shown you with the mesh. So I can press X on the keyboard and I can delete a vertices. So highlight one and delete it. But that will change the shape of my curve. So I can delete them. I could also select several of them and press X, and I could delete a segment. Now notice what happens there. I've got a gap in my curve now. So if I come out of edit mode, and if I just notice the properties panel again has disappeared when we go into edit mode, so I can press T on the keyboard and remove that. If I go, however, over to the properties panel and click on the curve, I can actually put the bevel back in here. So if I click on this one, and I'm actually going to enter in a value of, let's say, 0.2 to give it quite a bit of thickness, you'll see my torus knot doesn't quite match up. That's because I've deleted a segment of it. And also you'll notice if I zoom in here, there's a gap at the end. Now if you tried to 3D print this object, you'd have real problems. It's not filled in at the end. This object wouldn't 3D print. So we need to fill in the end. Well, we can fill in the end by clicking here to fill in the caps. It's not actually showing it in this instance. It should do. Or we can click here. Yeah, that one definitely worked. I'm not sure why the fill caps hasn't worked. It should fill in the caps there. Cyclic U, if you tick this one, it will complete the curve. It will make the curve into a cycle, and it will complete it. So it's effectively put the segment back in that I deleted. So fill caps should fill in the end. I'm not quite sure what's happening to this one. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to leave it like that with fill caps ticked, and I'm going to change this object into a mesh now. Now when we change it into a mesh, no, it hasn't. It still hasn't filled in the caps there. It should do. When we change it into a mesh and go into edit mode, notice we've now got faces, not control points. We've got faces now, similar faces to what we had in the sphere, and not a curve running down the middle. So when we take a curve and go to Tools, Objects and convert it to a mesh, Fluid Designer wraps the outside of the object around the object and turns it all into a mesh. Now this object will not print at the moment, so we do need to put a face at the end. So let me just press A on the keyboard to deselect that, and I'll show you how we can add a face onto the end of this mesh. Well, what I need to do is to highlight all around the outside of this. Well, these are called edges. So if I click the right mouse button and change to edge select mode, and if I click on that edge, you can see I can select one edge at a time. So I could hold down the shift key and select the edges around here. A better way to do it is if I actually hold down the Alt key on the keyboard and click on an edge. Notice that it's highlighted all the way around. All the way around. And if I now press F on the keyboard, now F is really for fill or for face, think of it as face as well, it's fill. It adds in a face to the end, and I must have that if I'm going to 3D print this object. So let's look at the other end of the torus knot. So I'll press A to deselect that face, and if I zoom in here, so if I hold down the Alt key and click on that edge, and I must be in edge select mode, you'll see that all the edge around the object is selected, and if I press F on the keyboard, it will fill it in, and then A to deselect that. Now objects must be what's called watertight. They must have an end cap there. So if this option over here in the properties panel doesn't put a face in the end, which it normally does, you would have to put it in yourself there. So if we press the tab key now, we can come out of edit mode. So we've got a torus knot there, which started off as a curve, but by going to Tools, Object Tools, I converted it into a mesh. And we've got a UV sphere there, which I created as a mesh to start off with. So with curve objects, you've got to wrap around an outline to them to create a solid object. Now if I just go to File and New, I don't want to save those. If I go to, let's see, what shall I go to? I'll go to Pendants. If I go to Pendants, and I'll just scroll down, and I'll select a 35mm pendant here. If I just drag and drop that onto the workspace. Now this looks like a solid object at the moment. It isn't, however. It is a curve, and it's a curve that's made up of a NURBS circle curve. It's got a straight line, what's called a path curve, and then it's got another NURBS circle at the end. And I can see that if I press the tab key and go into edit mode. These are actually control points which we can adjust, and notice they'll change the shape of the curve. So this isn't a mesh at the moment, it's a curve. And if I come out of edit mode, and if I go over to the properties panel, you'll see that we've got the curve item here in the properties panel. That indicates this object is a curve, and also in the outliner window, this 35mm pendant has got a curve icon here also. Now notice the cyclic U and the fill caps are selected here. If I remove that, notice that a big chunk of my circle disappears. Removing the fill caps isn't going to make much difference in this instance, because there isn't any object that's got an open end to it. But if I remove the bevel object, the 1x2 cross section here, what that means is that this is 1mm and this is 2mm. If I remove that, there we get back to the curve. And if I just zoom in and go into edit mode, you'll see that this is a curve object, not a mesh. And those are what are called control points. So if I press tab key to come out of edit mode there, so if I apply a thickness around this object, I change the curves. Sorry, I apply a bevel object around the curve, I give it some solidity. These objects here are all curves as well. to be used to create pendants, but they haven't got any bevel object around them. Now when you create a pendant, and I'll just go to view and I think view it from there, if I just add a couple of extra curves to the middle here, oops, just zoom in and position it in the center. If I hold down the shift key and highlight those two curves and then join them together, and then if I hold down the shift key and highlight the pendant itself and join the curves in the middle, these curves in the middle, to the pendant curve, notice that thickness is now applied, a bevel object is now applied to that square and that straight line curve. This whole object is still a curve, it's not a mesh yet, but if I go to File and export it as a wavefront object, Fluid Designer will convert it to a mesh before it saves the file to the hard disk. So whenever you go to File and Export, this curve will change to a mesh when you go to File and Export it as an object file. We can also change this to a mesh by going to Tools, Object Tools and Convert to Mesh. But you don't really need to do that, generally speaking, in Fluid Designer. But if I do, notice the colour changes. And when I zoom in this time and press the Tab key on the keyboard, you can see that it's now made up of faces. Each of these is a face. And if I click the right mouse button and change to Vertex Select mode, I can select individual vertices there and manipulate them. My curve has disappeared now because I've changed this object. I've changed it from a curve into a mesh. And you must convert objects into meshes to 3D print them, but you don't necessarily need to convert them here. When you go to File and Export, this will do it for you as it exports it. Okay, so that's a little bit about meshes and curves in Fluid Designer for 3D printing. So that's the end of this particular video. Thank you.